to get logged on.
And we can just kind of have some fun before we get going.
All I wanna do. Sorry,
and Juan,
I heard that song
will you get Karlo on there as well?
You don't want to introduce him?
No. Everybody knows. I mean, this is not an episode per se. This is more of just Karlo.
Yeah.
Like
everybody who clicks the link
will
knows
already
who Karlo
know.
Is.
Everybody knows Karlo.
Oh, here's the question I was asking while I was on mute. Do y'all know how many are signed on?
We will.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. As we go. I mean, we have... I will tell you. We currently have 283 patrons. So, many of them said that they will be coming on. So I don't know how many will go on as we go, but...
Sure.
But that's
it
that's
doesn't
where we
matter.
are.
I was just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, we can see on the YouTube video, YouTube will tell you how many people are watching a live video. I poured that for you, my friend.
Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome, Adam.
There are times that I realize that you're a very good friend, and then there's times that I think that you're not.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I'm not a good friend. So... I saw Robert Martin at Brahms today.
Oh yeah,
in his taekwondo outfit.
Nice.
Like that, he looked so funny. Like he's so tall. It's like that is the longest taekwondo uniform I've ever seen.
Nice. I'm gonna turn my internet off though. Will you turn your internet off your phone?
My Wi-Fi.
Yes.
How do you want to call it? Like 5 ways of San Thomas Aquinas?
Or just what about the 5 ways?
Yeah.
I
sent out. Okay, so
El
there's
Cinco ways.
So we got 9 people already logged on. Now that we just sent out the
Did you send it to?
link.
You said you emailed it to me.
Yes. Now that we sent out the link, so we should be good there. I'm gonna walk outside real quick, Karlo. I'll be right back. I'm just gonna double check and make sure the audio sounds good on actual YouTube.
Okay.
So 1 second.
I will allow it. Now there's 11 people. Is that how many? How many did he say? Did he say 11?
He said 9.
Oh.
Quote. Check.
Sounds good.
Check.
Getting any better?
That's typically that's our buddy Jim's job. He normally.
Oh, he's not there today?
No, he's not. He's actually fulfilling orders right now. So he's our shipping logistic manager as well. So he does like anybody who buys something on our store or signs up for Patreon, he ships them everything. So he's working on that tonight. Turn yours off.
Stand by.
Turn your...
Yeah, it's me.
I'll just check in the comment.
Okay, good. Everybody says it sounds good. So
You might want to change that text to the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah. Juan, what I gave you. Just use that.
What is it that 5 ways to proof?
To prove.
Did you put proof?
Yeah, he put PROOF.
Well,
that is
English is his second language.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to do this if I was. Hey, Juan, also hit the record button.
Can you change that on your end?
You want to start?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's 8:30.
Yeah, let's.
So also if you can
Let me fix it really quick.
okay. Just put the 5 ways by
Yeah,
St.
the
Thomas
5 ways.
Aquinas.
Everybody says audio sounds good, Karlo. So we're good there.
And someone said you have a cute shirt.
Well, Tyler said that because he bought this shirt, and some guy came up to him and was like, "Hey, cute shirt," and he was like, he sent me a text message. He's like, "Dude, I want my money back because that's ridiculous." There's a guy who said "cute shirt," And I was like, dude, I don't blame you for you want your money back, but there's no refunds.
Why would he say that?
I don't know.
Like, that is not. It's a very like regular shirt.
It's a regular
like there's
shirt.
nothing even.
I don't know. Okay, so we have 16 people on.
How funny.
Juan, if you'll go ahead and hit record. Thank you. Shout out to Juan because he's making everything happen. So Karlo, if you're good, I'll go ahead. We'll go ahead and get started, and
We're gonna do some intro music. We should.
No, we'll just go. I can lay it in.
He can click the button.
You can click the button now? Okay, go ahead, Juan. Yeah, Juan. Let's go ahead and get the full effect. We don't have to do the actual intro, but just the music.
And once the music stops, stop that
track. Otherwise, it'll play again in 12 minutes.
Right. Oh, we have to pray, bro.
Oh yeah, we gotta pray. Let's pray real quick, Karlo. Sorry, golly, we're terrible Catholics. Let's pray. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
My Queen and my Mother, I give myself entirely to you, and to show my devotion to you, I consecrate to you this day my eyes, my ears, my mouth, my heart, my whole being without reserve. Wherefore, good Mother, as I am your own, keep me, guard me, as your property and possession. Amen.
Saint Joseph,
pray for us. Saint Thomas Aquinas,
pray for us.
Pray for
Father,
us.
Son, Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay. You good, Juan? Juan's killing it over there. Okay. So, good.
Double fisting. Yeah. I like to party.
I was gonna say gentlemen, but we also have ladies who are supporting the Catholic Man Show, and so friends of the Catholic Men Show, welcome. We are very excited to have our very first course that we're offering to our patrons. We thought no one else to start us off than our good friend Karlo Broussard, who is Catholic Answers speaker, apologist, writer, philosophical extraordinaire, and so we're excited to have him on for the 9 lessons course that we're going to be doing on St. Thomas Aquinas. This is 5 ways, the proof for existence of God. Today we're going to go through, so here's how it's going to work. This is the introduction class. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion between Karlo, Dave, and I for about an hour, roughly, plus or minus, however long we're long-winded. So, but typically about an hour long. Throughout the conversation, you guys are more than welcome to submit questions in the comment section. Juan will be able to see these as they go. However, we are not going to address questions, or we're not going to field any kind of questions until at the very end. Now, at the very end, it's open game. Now, because this is the first of 9, this is the introduction class. If you ask a question in specific, like in relation to something that we're going to be diving into deeper in another class, Karlo may punt on the answer, so that way we don't get hung up on that question, and we'll answer that question as the course goes on. But feel free to answer or to ask as many questions as you want. This whole course is for you guys, and so selfishly it's for us as well, because I'm going to learn a lot. Now, another thing that I just want to say is, obviously, I'm going to sound very dumb. I don't know a lot of the answers to these questions, and so I'm going to be very vulnerable. I'm going to ask Karlo very probably elementary level questions in his mind, but I want to make sure that I understand what he's talking about as well. So there's no dumb questions. Feel free to ask any questions that you want, because this isn't something about flexing your intellectual muscles. It's more about let's learn about our Creator to only fall deeper in love with Him. So
word. And just for the record, I also might ask a dumb question, and if I do, it's probably because I'm thinking that Adam wants to ask it,
and in your humility,
and he's too afraid, and so I'm asking it for you,
me,
right?
Which I appreciate.
So I also might ask dumb questions, but that's why.
Well, it's good clarification.
Right. Yeah, I just want to exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Karlo, thanks for hanging out with us this evening. Thanks for putting together. I sent out the handouts that you put together. It's extensive. You guys will be able to look through this. I highly recommend at the very end. He even put a lot more references to go deeper into the topic. Once if we just wet the whistle, so to speak, and you want to get deeper into it, he gives you a lot of opportunities to dive deeper into each way, especially in this introduction level. So, Karlo, I'm going to, as long as you're okay with it, Dave,
yeah.
I'm going to pass the baton over to you, Karlo. I'm going to let you kind of lay the baseline. You guys, you can kind of start things. If Dave and I have a question or we want to stop you or something like that, we may do that. But I'm going to let you kind of go for it, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so feel free to jump in at any time, and I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity to hang out with you for the next 9 lessons on Aquinas' 5 ways. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us and watching the webinar. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully it'll be enlightening. Hopefully you can learn a thing or 3 in order to be able to better able to defend God's existence and share the truth of God's existence with others. So, Adam, you were asking me to give the lay of the land for the webinar itself. So just by way of introduction and what is the outline of the webinar, as you mentioned, Adam, this particular lesson is an introductory lesson. And what we'll do, so first of all, it's going to be every Monday and Wednesday night, right, throughout the month of January. And then the 9th lesson will be on that first Monday of February. So what we're going to do is tonight go through the introduction, and then we're going to have lesson 2 and 3 will deal with the first way. So we're going to divide the first way into 2 lessons, the first of which will be an articulation of the argument itself, going through the various steps of the argument, defending the premises of the argument. And then in lesson 3 of the webinar, which will be the second part of the first way, we're going to focus specifically on answering objections specific to the first way.
I think that's where I'm going to have a lot of questions. I think that's where I'm going to be because that's where the meat is, in my opinion. If you don't understand the first way, the other ones are going to be, some of them are going to be more difficult. So I'm excited about the first way in and of itself.
Right.
Because I got a lot of questions, and there's a lot of discussion, even in today. The modern philosophical debates today are really focused a lot on the first way.
That is true, and because many of the principles that underlie the first way are found in the other ways as well. Of course, that's flowing from the very nature of these metaphysical proofs, that the principles are going to be utilized in all of the 5 ways. But it becomes most manifest. Even St. Thomas Aquinas says the first way is the most manifest way, because we're starting with something that is self-evident to the senses and everybody can recognize, unless you're in a philosophy class trying to doubt the existence of motion or change, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the most manifest way, and we're able to extract from that experience certain philosophical principles that will lead us to the conclusion of an unmoved mover. And those principles will be found and or used in the other 4 of the 5 ways. So the lesson 4, we're going to look at the second way. And like the first way, we're going to divide the second way up into 2 parts. So lesson 4 will be the articulation of the argument itself. And that's going to be an intense argument as well, because it goes even deeper, I would say, than the first way, in order to grasp some of the principles involved. And then in lesson 5, which is the second part of the second way, once again, we'll address specific objections to the second way. And then lesson 6, we'll spend that lesson looking at the third way of St. Thomas and answer objections to that argument as well. In lesson 7, we'll look at the fourth way, from the degrees of perfection and reasoning to a maximal being, and look at some objections to the fourth way. And then lessons 8 and 9, we're going to devote to the fifth way. In the first part, lesson 8, we'll articulate the argument itself and see how it maps on with what St. Thomas says in the Summa Theologiae. And then in lesson 9, we'll address, once again, specific objections posed to the fifth way. And just for you watching, as Adam said, we're going to try to have a conversation between us for anywhere from 50 to 60 minutes. And then after that, we'll open it up for some questions. Since this lesson is an introductory lesson, it may very well be less than the 50 minutes. We'll see how fast we get through the material. Sure. Mm-hmm. Adam also mentioned that you guys have the handouts. So I'll be sending handouts to Adam and David, and they'll be sending them out to you guys for the whole webinar. Each lesson will have detailed handouts. And I'm going to do my best to just follow the handout, go point by point, and articulate the material for you. So you should be able to follow along fairly easy. One last point about the handout. I did make some minor changes to the handout for tonight's lesson. So Adam and David, what I'll do is I'll send you the updated version, and then you can just send them out to everybody who's signed up, okay?
Sure.
No problem.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage everybody. I've gone through things like this with Karlo before. The handouts, just the way he presents, the handouts are very, I think, beneficial to have in front of you, just because you can kind of see where we're going, and there's
you can see the structure of the reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. That's the handout. I think you do a good job on those handouts. There's not like a whole bunch of extra information on there that we're not going to bring up, and it's also not a script, so it's just like a good. Right. It really is a good resource to have as you're watching the videos. So I just want to put out that encouragement.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. So let's go ahead and establish an outline for tonight's lesson as an introduction to St. Thomas's 5 Ways. What I want to do tonight is I want to cover 4 main topics. You might say there are 4 main sections to tonight's lesson. Number 1 is looking at the 5 ways and their general method. So just establishing the general method that Aquinas is using in each of the 5 ways, and then see that general method in each of the 5 ways. Obviously, we're not going to go into great detail in each of the 5 ways because that's what the webinar is for 8 other lessons. But I do want you to see how each of the 5 ways fits this general method that Aquinas is using in arguing to God's existence. The second major section for tonight's lesson is just some general things to know about the 5 ways. Right? Just miscellaneous things that you need to know. What is unique to the 5 ways? What is not unique to the 5 ways? Various things to know. The third section for tonight's lesson is the nature of the 5 ways as demonstrative arguments. This is a common question that comes up. How does Aquinas view the 5 ways? Are they merely probable arguments that would lead to probable knowledge, a conclusion such that there's fear that the conclusion might in principle be wrong? Or are they demonstrative arguments? And we'll get into more detail later, but demonstrative arguments gives us a conclusion such that we have no fear that it is wrong in principle, because to deny the conclusion would end up denying certain first principles of knowledge and being. We're going to see that Aquinas believes these 5 ways are demonstrative in nature. So the conclusion can be known with what is called metaphysical certainty, an absolute certainty. It's not a moral certainty like I'm confident that it's true, but I know it's true. In the language of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, it would be scientific knowledge, not scientific knowledge in the modern concept of science, but scientific in the sense that it leads to demonstrative knowledge and absolute certainty. Okay,
so
because it comes from science, which means knowledge.
So for those who may not have like a philosophy background, when you say even metaphysics in and of itself, some people may not understand what even metaphysics are. Right. So maybe because you're talking about like metaphysically, we can prove that this is the case. That may not be a foreign concept to him. Sure. What do you mean by that?
Let's just substitute that with philosophical, right? Where we're going to use reason, looking at reality, and I'm going to come to a conclusion that I know this conclusion conforms to what is real, is true. Okay?
All men are mortal, Socrates is mortal.
Therefore, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Yeah.
Right.
That
So
may
I
actually
know
work the
that
other way too.
conclusion.
What?
That may actually work the other way too. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go
Well,
ahead.
we're going to see that you could start with the nature of man, and then reason to Socrates being subject to death. Starting with an understanding of the nature of man, but that's later on down for tonight's lesson. But metaphysics, guys, Adam and David, metaphysics just is the study of reality or being insofar as it's being. So we're not studying some carved out aspect of being, like being as living beings, or beings as inanimate beings, such as material objects that aren't alive within the physical cosmos and how they move and interact with each other. We're not even focusing merely on intelligent beings. We're just focusing on being as being and what can we know about reality, right?
Just things that exist.
Things that exist. Existence, right? Or being is the object of study in what we call metaphysics, beyond physical reality, things within physical reality. So being sort of goes beyond all of these categories, right? This is why we call it a transcendental. Whether being is not refined to the physical thing in front of me, namely the computer. Being is not restricted to the plant or the tree outside. Being is not restricted to the Fido the dog that I might have as a pet. Being is not restricted to you and you, Adam, and you, David, and me as human beings. Being transcends all of these categories. So when I'm going to metaphysically analyze you, Adam and David, I'm going to analyze what are you as a being? What are the principles of being, both for human beings and then outside of human beings for reality in general. So that's just metaphysics. Now, metaphysical certainty just simply refers to when I come to that conclusion, I know it's true and I have no fear of error. There's no possibility in principle that the conclusion could be false. That's basically what we mean by metaphysical certainty. I'll get to this distinction more later on tonight, okay? And then finally, the fourth section for tonight is some objections to God's existence being demonstrated. So St. Thomas Aquinas, before he even gets to the five ways, he considers some objections to demonstrating God's existence, because he's asking the question, can God's existence be demonstrated? He's going to answer in the affirmative, as we'll see later on tonight. But he wants to address some of the objections that are posed to the claim that God's existence can be demonstrated. So we want to address some of that, and that'll be a good segue into moving on in our next lesson, I think, and starting with the first way. So that's a lay of the land for tonight's lesson. Good enough?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So I know I rattled on a bit there, but let's go in with the first section, and that is the five ways and their general method. So here's the general method. Aquinas wants to start with some datum of our experience, just something of our experience. So, for example, in the first way, it's motion, right? The stone moves from this point to that point. But motion can be considered also in a broader way. So it's not just like local motion, where the stone moves from this point to that point. It could be a qualitative motion or change, such as I used to have hair, now I don't, right? Or if I had hair, if I dyed it green, that would be a sense of motion or change, right? It would be a qualitative motion. And then there's also quantitative motion. So I can become fatter, I can become thinner, given the quantity of my weight. That's considered motion or change as well. So all Aquinas wants to do is just start with some datum of our experience, okay? Then he wants to reason to the need, like the philosophical need. And it's like, it's a need based upon being or what is real. It's not just like, I need it to be in order to make me feel good, right? Or I need it just because I gotta justify my belief in God. What Aquinas wants to say is, I start with this datum of experience and reason to a need for a cause to account for that experience. right? A cause
Which is the
outside
difference from where Aristotle was. Or this is where he kind of branches off from Aristotle, correct?
In which way?
Well, Aristotle talks more about in the motion, insofar as like he's actually talking about. It seems like locomotion, like actual physical motion that's happening, not necessarily change. It seems like maybe I'm wrong.
No,
but
that's actually Aristotelian. All of this is what I said so far is in Aristotle. But as we're going to see, and I'll articulate this, that there is a unique aspect to Aquinas' approach of the first way that does go beyond what Aristotle has in his understanding of a proof to an unmoved mover from motion. Okay, but all of this so far is in Aristotle. We have the experience of motion, some experience, and we reason to the need of an extrinsic cause to account for that datum of experience, in this case, motion. Okay? Now, Aquinas next, in this general method, shows the impossibility of having a series of causes that accounts for the datum of our experience without a cause, such that it's without a cause that doesn't derive from something else what it needs to be a cause of what we're experiencing. All right. So in other words, we reason to the need for a cause such that it doesn't derive from another what is needed to be a cause of the experience. So in our case of the first way, we're going to see we're reasoning if we have a series of moved movers. Aquinas wants to say that it's impossible to have that series without a mover such that it's not deriving from another what it needs to be a mover of the motion in question. Okay? So we have an experience. We account for that experience by positing an extrinsic cause of that experience. And then we want to show that if there's a series of causes that's accounting for that sensory experience of what we're experiencing, that series cannot be without a cause such that it's not receiving from another what it needs to be a cause of the datum of our experience. Okay? So that's the general method.
You know, I really like this. This kind of surprised me about Aquinas because I've always thought about him as being someone who's kind of above the everyday man. But when I learned this about him, it shocked me because his ways are actually very common to everybody. It's like he approaches it from the way that everybody can understand. It's like you've all encountered a rock. You've encountered a tree. You know, it's like if you've encountered a rock and a tree and like maybe some flowing water or something, you know, like then you can understand the five ways. Anyway, I just wanted to make that comment because it's...
Amen. And you're spot on, David, at least the beginning point and the starting datum of the five ways. Now, the principles that we're going to extract very quickly go very high.
They do.
The strata of philosophical reasoning. But watch this. I'm glad you brought that up, David, because now we're going to see the general method as it's applied to the five ways. This is a brief summary of the five ways so our viewers kind of know what the five ways are about. But as you're going to see, the first way starts with motion or change. That's pretty mundane, right? Second way starts with efficient causes, right? I know that I needed mommy and daddy before I came into existence, right? I know that the lamp needs the desk right now to be suspended 4 feet above the ground, okay? That's the second way, efficient causes. Third way, I'm sure you've experienced things that come into existence and things that go out of existence, right? There was a time when the flower in the flower bed of my house did not exist before it was produced in seed form. And those flowers, they went out of existence because they're no longer in the flower bed because we're horrible at keeping flowers alive in our flower bed, right?
Sounds like goldfish in my house growing up. I think 3 days was our record. 3 days. We had a goldfish that lasted 3 days.
3 days?
Yeah.
Nice.
That was the best.
The fourth?
Yeah. Sorry.
The fourth way. So let's take your goldfish. We recognize that your wife, David, is a greater good than goldfish. Your children are greater goods than goldfish, right? There's a hierarchy of goodness there when we compare the goldfish to your children and to your wife. Any Joe Blow on the street can get that. And then the fifth way, we can take an acorn. The fact that an acorn is directed in its activity to grow up and develop into an oak tree. These are the mundane things that serve as starting points of our experience that, as we're going to see, allow us to reason to God's existence. So I just wanted to emphasize what you said, David. You're spot on in saying that these 5 ways, Aquinas is a realist. He's starting with what is real, what is present there and self-evident to us in our experience, okay? So that's something that has an appeal to the non-professional philosopher. All right. Now, how can we apply this general method to the 5 ways? All right. So let's start with the first way. I sort of already articulated it, but let's do it again. Aquinas wants to start with motion, and that's broadly understood as change, okay? And then he realizes that motion is such that whatever is in motion requires something extrinsic to it to account for its motion. Like whatever's in motion can't explain that it's in motion in virtue of itself. There's going to be a need for an extrinsic mover, something outside of itself that accounts for why it is in motion rather than not. Okay? Now, that mover, that cause of motion, whatever it is, it's either going to have the act of being a mover, like what it needs to be a mover, the act of being a mover. It's either going to have that activity in virtue of what it is, in virtue of itself, or from another. If that mover has what it needs to be a mover, the act of being a mover in virtue of itself, in virtue of its own essence, well, then that's the unmoved mover. That's what we could call God. But if that cause of motion that we immediately arrive at, if its act of being a mover is not had in virtue of itself, well, then it's going to have to receive that activity of being a mover from a mover outside of itself. And so there we have a series of movers. Now, Aquinas goes on to show, as we're going to see, that this series of moved movers, no matter how many you put in the series, cannot be such that it lacks a mover that doesn't derive from another what it needs to be a mover. So if you have mover 1, it derives from another what it needs to be a mover. And mover 2, it derives from another what it needs to be a mover. And mover 3 derives from another what it needs to be a mover of the stone in motion. Aquinas shows that such a series, we're going to show, that such a series cannot be without a mover, such that it does not receive from another what it needs to be a mover of the movers in the series and ultimately the stone. And so Aquinas concludes that there must exist an unmoved mover, a mover such that it does not receive its activity of being a mover from another, but has that activity of being a mover in virtue of its own essence. That's just what it is. Its nature is to be a mover, is to have the activity of causing motion in other things outside of itself. And that's what we call God. So notice the general method. Sensory experience, the need for an extrinsic cause to account for that which we experience, and then reasoning to the need for a cause of that experience such that it does not receive from another what it needs to be a cause of that experience. So that's the first way. Does that make sense?
Is this the infinitely long train analogy?
Yes. If you're understanding the infinite regression as all of these movers acting as movers here and now to account for the motion under consideration, not understood such that I was begotten by my Father who was begotten by his Father. Because the begetting activity of my grandfather is
Has
not
nothing to do-
necessary
Right.
here and now when I'm engaging in my begetting activities.
Okay, right. Yeah.
That's not the kind of series Aquinas has in mind. What he's accounting for is your example where you have an interlinked train cars moving right here and right now, where motion is being imparted to each of the train cars, ultimately by the engine car, right? Mm-hmm. That's imparting the motion to those train cars that can't act as movers of other cars in virtue of themselves. They're deriving that power to be a mover from ultimately the engine car, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's sort of the idea of a series of movers that Aquinas has in mind. Okay,
and
so that's the first.
And we go through the first way. We'll talk about like why there can't be an infinite number of cars. Correct? Like why
that's correct.
It can't just continue going before.
Well, it could be There could be an infinite number of cars, but they still had to have a beginning. Like a ray of light will go on for infinity, but it still had to start somewhere.
There has to be a source.
Yeah.
Well, I would qualify the start. Adam, you hit the nail on the head. You identified the correct understanding as a source. David, when you say start, that immediately triggers temporal beginning.
Okay.
But what we want to find is an ontological beginning.
Gotcha.
Right? And that's just a big fancy word for a source of being, a source of reality, a source of the activity of acting like a mover or acting as a mover. That's what we're looking for, the source.
We'll dive deeper into this, definitely.
That's right.
I was just curious if I've heard that in the train car analogy, and I just wanted to see if that's the first way. Yeah,
that's legit. The train car analogy is a good analogy to introduce what kind of series of causes or movers are we talking about. Okay. Now let's see the general method applied to the second way very briefly. So Aquinas starts with the nature of an efficient cause, which is basically a cause that makes something to be. So you have a sculptor that makes the statue. The sculptor is an efficient cause. My mother and father are efficient causes of me in some respects. The desk that's holding the lamp and suspending it 4 feet above the ground is an efficient cause to some degree. Now, Aquinas wants to take the nature of an efficient cause and apply it to the things that exist. Now, here's what's key about the nature of an efficient cause. An efficient cause is prior to the effect, not necessarily in time, like my mom and dad, prior to me in time as an efficient cause, but more fundamental, like ontologically, like the desk right now, as an efficient cause of the lamp being 4 feet above the ground, it's not prior to the effect in time, but it's ontologically prior, right? You got to have the efficient cause in order to have the effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The effect can't happen without the cause.
That's right. And the effect can't be ontologically before the cause, right?
Even if they happen at the same time.
That's right. Without the cause, you don't have an effect. So the cause is prior to the effect, not necessarily in time, but ontologically. That's what Aquinas wants to start with.
I've heard the analogy of when you put your head down on the pillow, your head creates a dent in the pillow. Okay, so that happens at the same time. Your head touches the pillow, but your head is still prior. It's the efficient cause of the dent in the pillow.
At the time the head is denting the pillow, the denting is happening.
Right. So they happen at the same time. Right.
That's right, which is distinct from when you laid your head down and began the denting, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So Aquinas wants to focus on the here and now of the cause being prior to the effect. So Aquinas takes the nature of efficient causality and applies it to things that exist and says, well, things that exist, they can't possibly cause themselves to exist because the cause has to be prior to the effect, right? If something caused itself to exist, it would have to exist prior to causing itself to exist, which is absurd. Follow that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, keep in mind here, Aquinas is assuming a lot. He's assuming that the things I'm experiencing in my daily life, like the plant or the flower or the tree, are things such that they need to be caused in their existence. He's just assuming that in the second way. So that's going to have to be unpacked when we dive deep into the second way as to why the tree outside needs a cause outside of itself to account for why it exists rather than not. Okay?
Okay.
But let's just grant that for summary's sake. And Aquinas wants to say, well, if the things of our experience that exist in the world cannot be the cause of their own existence, well, then they're going to have to be caused by some cause outside of themselves. The fact that they exist rather than not, that they have existence, what Aquinas calls in Latin esse, the act of being, the act of existence, that in virtue of which the tree is something rather than nothing. That tree is going to require a cause outside of itself to account for why it has this existence, this esse, that in virtue of which it is something rather than nothing. Okay? So we have tree, that's our experience. It exists. And assuming that we've already articulated the principles that the tree is something such that it needs a cause outside of itself to exist, now we have a cause of its existence. So far, so good?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Now, like in the first way, Aquinas is basically reasoning and saying, well, if that cause of the tree's existence is such that it doesn't derive its own existence from a cause outside of itself, well, then we've arrived at a first cause, an uncaused cause, what we could call God. Because that cause would simply have existence in virtue of its own essence or nature. That's just what it would be. Its nature would be to exist. And therefore wouldn't require some cause outside of itself to give it existence. But if, hypothetically speaking, the cause of the tree's existence is such that it does need to derive its existence from a cause outside of itself, well, then we have a series of causes, right? A series of causes of the tree's existence, right here and right now. Just like you have the lamp being held up by a series of links of chain hooked to the ceiling, here and now, the links of the chain are accounting for the lamp being suspended in air. So do these causes in this hypothetical series are causes that are acting here and now at every moment the tree exists. Okay? That's the kind of series of causes we're talking about. Not causes of existence like my mom and dad 39 years ago, plus 9 months. Okay? Here and now.
And that's different than the cosmological argument that Thomas kind of rejected from St. Anselm, correct? I mean, this is different insofar as what Anselm is putting out on the table, right?
Yes, this, and we're going to get to this, is further down in the notes, but it's proper to bring it up here. What we're doing, what Aquinas is doing, is reasoning from an effect to the existence of a cause, and that's cosmological because we're starting with something in the cosmos and reasoning to a cause that accounts for that datum of experience within the physical cosmos. Okay? Anselm's argument is called the ontological argument. It starts with the nature of the cause that we call God, and then reasons to the conclusion that God exists from our knowledge of what God is. That's what Aquinas rejects.
Yeah, I said cosmological. I meant ontological. The ontological
argument. Yeah, that's called an a priori argument or a propter quid argument, which is in the notes further down, because we're starting with the nature of something and then reasoning to some conclusion that follows from our knowledge of the nature itself. Of the thing.
Yeah,
that
makes sense.
I can see how that would be a lot harder to prove.
Yeah,
that would be harder to prove.
Well, you have to start with knowledge of the nature of something. So, for example, as I point out in your handout, this kind of argument would be analogous to this. whatever being, whatever is such that it's a corporeal being, it's subject to death. Whatever is a corporeal being is subject to death, naturally subject to death. Johnny is a corporeal being, or Adam or David. Therefore, Adam, David, are beings such that they are subject to death. Notice we started with the nature of a corporeal being,
Right.
and then reasoned the conclusion that corporeal beings are mortal. They're subject to death. The type of arguments we're doing with Aquinas here is what is called a quia argument or a posteriori argument. After experience. We're starting with experience. After the fact of experience of motion, then we're going to reason from that effect, motion, to the need or the existence of a cause, ultimately, of that motion.
Right.
So what we're doing is we're reasoning that the cause of the motion exists from the effect. It's called quia because quia in Latin means that it exists. So notice the distinction between the two approaches of these demonstrative arguments. One starting with the nature of something, then reasoning to a conclusion that follows from that knowledge of the nature of something. That's not what we're doing with Aquinas' 5 ways. What Aquinas is doing is starting with effects and reasoning to the existence of a cause, an ultimate cause, that accounts for that effect. Does that make sense?
This is why rhetoric is so important, and like why we like just do a disservice to our children for not like teaching them, because like both of those, if you don't lay them out, they sound like, oh well, you're saying almost the same thing, but you're not. I mean,
yeah, but you're not at all.
You're not at all.
And I can see how.
But I could sell it as if I'm saying the same thing. I'm basically saying the same thing. We're all almost on the same page.
But I could see how an atheist could reject Anselm's argument, because he would say, well, you want there to be a God, so you made up you made up a nature for him.
You're putting the conclusion ahead of it,
right?
So
Exactly.
That way you're already going to come out.
It's very hard to reject Aquinas' argument because the those experiences are so common to everyone. We all see the motion. We all see the causes of things, and
that's correct. Yeah, and so you're opening up a can of worms here concerning the ontological argument and why Aquinas and many other philosophers reject it. But we're going to bracket that for now because that's will take us into a different argument.
We get too deep.
No, that's fine. But it's important to draw the distinction between the two types of arguments in order to understand what Aquinas is doing. Okay, so getting back to the second way, recall that we started with the existence of things. Aquinas is assuming that these kinds of things need a cause outside of themselves to exist. If that cause in turn must receive its existence from a cause outside of itself, then we have a series of causes that's acting as a cause of the tree's existence at every moment the tree exists, right here and right now. These causes acting simultaneously to distinguish the tree from nothing, okay? Now, what Aquinas wants to do, as he does in the first way, is show that such a series cannot be without a cause such that it's not caused to exist. In other words, you can't have a series of causes that are all caused to exist by something outside of themselves. You're going to have at least one cause such that it doesn't need to derive existence from outside of itself because it has existence in virtue of its own essence. And that's what Aquinas reasons to as the first cause or the uncaused cause of existence. So this cause, whereas the unmoved mover accounts for motion, which we experience, the uncaused cause of the second way accounts for the existence of the things that we experience. Okay? Now,
so let me ask you this so I can get this just distinction in my head. I can see like two ways, and I think this is part of why people get this confused. One way is that like, okay, things exist when they, like everything that exists could not exist. Or if you think about it like...
Or at least the things of our experience.
Right, the things in this world. Exist. This table, me.
There you go.
So like my parents, you take it all the way back to Adam and Eve if you want to do it that way, like from beginning. Okay, well, who created Adam and Eve? Right, so now you have kind of like that first cause in that way. So there's that things exist when they could not exist. I see that. And then also, I mean, like, forget about the fact that my parents had to be born by parents who had to be born from parents. Then there's the whole, like, lamp being held up by a chain, where if a single one of those chains break, the lamp falls. You know, it's like my parents are, my great-great-great-grandparents, that chain can't break. You see what I'm saying? So what's the distinction? Which one of those is which way?
Okay, so your great-great-grandfather, who I assume is dead. Right?
Yes.
I'm
also assuming that. I mean,
he was responsible in some way for you to come into existence, but he's not that which accounts for you being something rather than nothing here and now.
Right. See, I can tell that there's a distinction here, but I'm not sure which to put in what place.
Where we're going to go is to analyze you, David, and Adam, and the tree outside as being such that cannot exist right here and right now without a cause such that it does not receive existence from something outside of itself.
And it's a constant thing. It's constant.
In as much as you exist, and at every moment you are something rather than nothing, that something rather than nothing, your existence, that you are something rather than nothing, distinct from nothing, is accounted for here and now by a cause such that it does not have to receive its own existence from something outside of itself, because it has existence in virtue of its own essence.
Right.
Its essence just is existence itself. Yeah. That's the kind of cause that Aquinas arrives at in the second way. And that's the kind of series of causality that we're focusing on.
Okay, yeah. I wanted you to make that distinction because I, in the past, have got confused with, an object in motion will remain in motion until another, it's not like God put something in motion in the past and it's like remaining in motion. No, he's holding it in motion.
That's right.
At every moment.
Even whether we're talking about motion right here and right now, if we freeze frame that motion, ultimately here and now, it's accounted for by the unmoved mover. If we take my existence, freeze frame my existence, I am something rather than nothing. Here and now, my existence is ultimately accounted for by an uncaused cause, a cause such that does not receive existence from something outside of itself, but has existence in virtue of its own essence. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's what we're arriving at in the second way. Now, so if y'all want, we can go forward with the third way.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
I apologize, I'm choking here. So the third way, actually, it's interesting. The third way is a cause for much debate, along with the other ways. But once you understand the third way, which I think the way I'm reading the third way is textually correct, and it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, it's kind of one of the easiest ways when you understand it. And here's basically what Aquinas is doing. Now, when we get to the third way, I'm going to go into greater detail, okay? But here's how I would summarize it. Aquinas is starting with things of our experience that come into existence, they begin to exist, and they go out of existence. Mm-hmm. That's a fact of experience. The flower in the flower bed, there was a time when the flower was not.
The deer that I shot this year is no longer in existence.
Right. And someday...
And there was a time when that deer did not exist before it was conceived, right, in its mother's womb. And so notice for these kinds of beings, it's a fact of our experience, there's non-being before it exists, right? There's a time when it was not. And there's non-being after it exists. There's a time when it goes out of existence, okay? Mm-hmm. That's what Aquinas wants to start with. Now, what Aquinas does, in my view, as I read the third way, Aquinas wants to focus on the non-being before the thing comes into existence. All right. And he's asking the question, is it possible that all of reality could consist of things at which time prior to its existence it did not exist? In other words, is it possible that all of reality could consist of things that begin to exist? And he wants to answer no. Because and we're going to get into more detail when we look at the third way, but basically his conclusion is that if all of reality consisted of these kinds of things that come into existence before which there was a time when they were not, nothing would exist now. But things do exist now, and so therefore it is not possible that all of reality consists of these kinds of beings that begin to exist. What Aquinas arrives at... Go ahead.
Well, okay, I just want to make sure I understand. I mean, so this is a...
I didn't prove it. I didn't prove that premise. I'm just stating the premise.
Okay, go ahead, and then I'll... Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Because I want to ask why.
Yeah, that was... I started going, whoa, time out. Yeah.
Yeah, all I'm doing is sketching the approach in the argument. I see things begin to exist and they go out of existence.
Right.
Is it possible that all of reality could consist of things that begin to exist? And Aquinas' answer is no. There must exist some being that has no beginning and has no end. A being such that there is no non-being before it exists and non-being after it exists. Does that make sense? I didn't prove that. I'm just stating that's what he's reasoning to.
Well, I'm not sure it makes sense to me.
Well, okay, because I haven't proved it. I haven't justified the premise. Okay. Because the premise is, if all of reality consisted only of beings that begin to exist, then nothing would exist now.
See, I don't see I don't see how that follows. Like, couldn't you just have things that are just always beginning to exist? And
that's the whole of lesson 6. That's the problem with these sort of introductory lessons.
Okay. All right. I'll say I can wait.
Yes.
But I remain a skeptic.
Right.
I reserve the right to be
Rightfully so. Okay.
Okay.
Now, so Aquinas
although Dave, you're wrong. Okay.
I'm prepared to disabuse myself of my skepticism.
Now, Aquinas is going to say it's not possible for all of reality to consist of beings that begin to exist, right? There has to be some being that has no beginning and no end.
Correct.
All right. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's God, right? Not yet. Not in Aquinas' mind.
I was wondering about an angel, actually.
That's right. It's something like an angel.
Like an immaterial being of some sort?
Right. There's nothing to the nature of such a being that requires that it have a beginning or have an end.
Okay.
It can naturally exist always, right? There's nothing in its nature that would prohibit it from naturally existing always. So like the nature of a tree, it belongs to the nature of a tree to naturally have a beginning and have an end.
Right.
If a tree was to always exist, that would be a miraculous thing. It would be above its nature. Follow me?
Mm-hmm. I might know of one tree
that has eternally existed.
Yeah, the tree of life. But we'll give a pass.
Given divine revelation, even that came into existence. It had a beginning. But let's say hypothetically it always existed.
Okay.
That would require a power outside of the tree. It required divine power to always exist, because it belongs to the nature of a tree to naturally begin to exist and end to exist and stop existing. Okay.
So let me ask you a question.
That's the kind of thing that Aquinas is starting with.
This is like one thing I struggle with, and I think it's difficult to accomplish, is to divorce my mind when we're using words like always and before, words that have that are rooted in temporalness. Like,
right.
How do I divorce? It's like, oh, God existed before everything. But it's like, well, but there was no before and after when
Right.
until he created. There wasn't even an until. Like there was no time. It's not like God was sitting there for eternity and then he created. God just is. And like time is something that the whole concept of time, he created that. So you can't apply those things to him because he's outside of them. So it's difficult to understand these kinds of arguments because they inherently use these words about before and after. And how do you apply before and after without time?
Yeah. Well, before the creation of the world, God was, right?
Yeah.
Well, philosophers talk about the metaphorical use of these temporal words. So here's an analogy. When we talk about nothing, right? Nothing, the absence of being, is there any real entity that word maps onto? No, because there's nothing, right? It's a word that we use to try to express some concept. So when we use the words like before time existed, before the beginning of the world, God existed, we're using that language in a metaphorical way. We do not imply this as if there is some referent to which the word maps onto in reality. Okay. It's just we're having to employ language that's limited and restricted to temporality, temporal concepts. So we're working with what we got. Okay, we're limping along.
I find that a satisfactory answer. Thank you, Karlo.
Okay, awesome. Now, getting back to the third way. So just to finish this up in summary form, Aquinas reasons that there's got to be some being that always exists without beginning, without end. And then Aquinas is going to ask, okay, well, does that being have its existence in virtue of its own essence, or is it deriving its existence from something outside of itself? And if it is deriving its existence from something outside of itself, then like in the second way, we have a series of these caused causes of existence. It's impossible to have this series without a cause, such that it does not receive its existence from a cause outside of itself. In other words, you got to have a cause to even account for the series of caused causes that has its existence. It's always existing, right? It's without beginning and without end existence in virtue of its own essence. And that's what Aquinas wants to call an absolutely necessary being. So he's arriving at the same kind of cause that he does at the end of the second way, just by a different route. Okay. Now, I see, man, I'm already running out of time, and I'm only on like page 3 of the handout.
Oh, that's okay.
It's okay. I mean, we don't have to. I mean, this is why we have the handout as well, right? So that way, if we don't get all to it, that's fine, because again, this is the introductory. We're going to dive deeper into all of this, and there's not a lot of questions. I don't think as of right now. There's only a couple as of right now. So like. And I kind of expect,
it's hard to say that, like, people might be waiting to ask their questions. If you do have a question, you don't have to wait.
Yeah, go ahead and post.
You can go ahead and post your question now, and then we can get to it. So feel free to ask away.
I expect there'd be less Q&A in the introductory.
I also expect that. Yeah.
Lesson. So anyway, go ahead. Sorry, we'll try to pull back the reins on our end and let you. Go, but
like you said, that's the purpose of the handouts, okay?
Right.
So just very quickly, the fourth way, as I mentioned before, Aquinas wants to start with degrees of perfection. Some things are more good than others. My wife is a higher good, a greater good than the flower in the flower bed. My children are a greater good than whatever pet that we used to have and we no longer have because we don't do pets anymore. Hopefully one day we can get back to the pet life. So there's these degrees of perfection. Now, what Aquinas reasons to is that whatever has degrees of being, like some things are more perfect than others, more good than others, more noble than others, that's an indication in Aquinas' mind that such beings need a cause outside of themselves for their existence, for their being, and consequently for their nobility or for their perfection or for their goodness. And then Aquinas is going to reason to a cause such that does not receive existence from outside of itself, but has existence in virtue of its own essence. And this is what Aquinas calls a maximal being. It is what Anselm would call that than which nothing greater can be conceived, a being that is just existence itself. Its nature is to exist.
He who is.
He who is. There is no being possibly greater than such being that is being itself. As Anselm said, you cannot conceive of any greater being than a being such that it has existence in virtue of its own essence. And then Aquinas is going to reason that cause, that maximal being, which is that maximal being that we reason to starting from the degrees of perfection, is a cause of all being and perfection outside of itself. And I emphasize all, because such a maximal being is not going to be just the ultimate cause of one thing that I experience or two things that I experience, namely my wife and the flower in the flower bed, but such a maximal being, a being that has existence in virtue of its own essence, is going to be the cause of everything other than itself that has being. And that's the fourth way, in sum, that is. And then finally, the fifth way, Aquinas wants to start with the observation. He does start with the observation that there are some things in our experience that lack intelligence. So take the acorn. But what we notice about these unintelligent beings is that they're ordered to certain ends or goals in their activity. So when we observe the acorn, all things considered, right, and barring accidental circumstances and like the acorn being defective and a flood totally saturating the acorn to where it's such that it can't do its thing and growing into an oak tree, okay? So if we just take the acorn and we observe it in its natural habitat and all things considered equal, barring accidental circumstances, the acorn's going to naturally develop into an oak tree. So notice it has this goal-oriented activity. Now Aquinas is going to argue that any such goal-directed activity, that wherever a thing is acting for some goal that's perfective of its nature, like it's acting towards some goal that's going to make it flourish as the kind of thing it is, such activity requires a directing intelligence. Okay? And then Aquinas is going to reason to the need for a directing intelligence of all things within nature that lack intelligence, but yet have this goal-oriented activity towards ends that are perfective of their natures. That undirected, directing intelligence that's governing and directing all natural things to their goals that are perfective of their nature is what we call God. And so that's a summary of the fifth way. Now, keep in mind, in all of these summaries, in no way have I justified any of the premises that Aquinas is working with to arrive at his conclusions of an unmoved mover, an uncaused cause, the absolutely necessary being, the maximal being, and the undirected directing intelligence of all natural things. These are the conclusions that Aquinas is arriving at based upon these certain premises that we're going to attempt to justify in the forthcoming lessons of our webinar. So that's the general method applied to the 5 ways. We start with a datum of experience. We reason to the need for a cause to account for that experience. And then further, we reason to the need for a cause such that doesn't receive from anything outside of itself what it needs to be a cause of the datum that we experience, whether it be motion, the existence of things, things coming into existence, the degrees of perfection, and natural things being directed to some end perfective of their nature. So that's a summary of the 5 ways.
And not all of these are Aquinas, as we've alluded to. Not all of these are Aquinas' original thoughts. We've talked about Aristotle before.
Right.
I mean, not all
And
of
so
this is. Go ahead.
Yeah, this leads to the second part of the on the handout, that just, concerning some general things to know about the five ways. One thing is that they're not entirely original to Aquinas. So the majority of the first way is coming from Aristotle. Some aspects of the second way are coming from some of the Islamic philosopher Avicenna, an early 11th century Islamic philosopher. Some parts of the third way are rooted in Aristotle as well. The fourth way seems to be a meshing of both Plato and Aristotle. And the fifth way, talking about these unintelligent things being goal-oriented in their activity, that's a principle we call in philosophy final causality. That's coming from Aristotle. So they're not entirely original to Aquinas, but some things are unique.
Yeah.
That's right. There are some things that are unique to Aquinas. And so this gets to his articulation of motion. So there's a way of viewing motion in a physical way. There's a way of viewing motion in a metaphysical way. Mm-hmm. And Aquinas is going to start with physical motion, like the stones being moved by the stick. Mm-hmm. But he's going to immediately jump to this metaphysical plane and define motion as the actuality of a potentiality. Don't worry, we're going to get
we'll get there.
Right. Second way,
go ahead.
There is something unique about the second way. You can read what's unique about Aquinas' five ways in the handout. Another thing that's very important to note about the five ways, guys, is that these are summaries that presuppose metaphysical principles, these philosophical principles about being or reality, right? So Aquinas is just stating these as lines of argumentation that one could employ in order to arrive at the conclusion that God exists. But these are summaries that are assuming an entire metaphysical universe, right?
Right.
And so in the lessons forthcoming, we're going to do our best to try to articulate some of those philosophical principles as we go through each of the five ways. Another thing to note is that the conclusion that Aquinas arrives at in each of the five ways are not the full blown out understanding of God as we classically understand him. Okay? What's important to note is that the various divine attributes that we ascribe to God, the full understanding of God, philosophically speaking, is embedded in the concept of an unmoved mover or an uncaused cause or the maximal being or the undirected directing intelligence. There are extra steps and more work that needs to be done to unpack these concepts and to see how the various divine attributes are embedded in them. So when you come to a mover that's not receiving its act of being a mover from anything outside of itself, this is what Aquinas would call purus actus, pure actuality. Well, embedded in that concept of pure actuality, you're able to deduce all of the various divine attributes that we philosophically ascribe to God. When you come to a cause such that it's not receiving existence from anything outside of itself, but has its existence in virtue of its own essence, it just is existence, well, you're able to deduce the various divine attributes from that. So the reason why this is important is because many times an atheist will say, well, Aquinas arrives at an unmoved mover, but that ain't God. Well, Aquinas doesn't intend for you to think that it is God. This is why he says this is what people call God. Because our understanding of God is embedded in the concept of an unmoved mover or an uncaused cause of existence. But more work needs to be done to unpack that in order to see it intellectually.
That's not where I thought you were going with that. I thought you were going to say, the five ways prove God exists, but doesn't prove he's Trinitarian. Like you can't just jump straight to the Trinity. To me, if there's an unmoved mover, it must be God. I mean, who is it if not God?
Right. Well, if the full understanding of God, as I said, is present in the concept of an unmoved mover. But you're going to have to unpack that in order to see that, well, how do I know an unmoved mover is the unmoved mover of all things outside of itself that is in motion right here and right now?
Yeah. Or how do I know that, he loves me?
Yeah, or that he cares about me.
How do I know that such an unmoved mover is omnibenevolent? How do I know that such an unmoved mover is omniscient? How do I know that an unmoved mover is omnipotent and that its causal power will extend to all things outside?
Or even intelligent. I mean, like an unmoved mover might not even be aware that you exist. I mean, obviously, by the fourth way, if intellect exists, there must be a perfection of intellect. So the
fifth
unmoved.
Way.
Oh, the fifth way. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So
the finality.
Intellect,
yeah. So obviously, he would be supremely, intelligent, but unmoved mover by itself. You're right.
And keep in mind that when we unpack these divine attributes, it's not that just the unmoved mover is a very, very powerful being. We're able to unpack that such a being is all powerful, right? Or the uncaused cause of existence is not just a cause that's very, very powerful, right, to bring things into existence, but that it is all powerful because its causality extends to everything that is, that exists. This is what we're talking about in metaphysics. Being, insofar as being, anything that is something rather than nothing is under the causal umbrella of this uncaused cause that we call God. So this is the point about the need for unpacking these concepts and arriving at the divine attributes. And as we go through the 5 ways, we'll do our best to try to do that. We're not going to be able to do them all because we just don't simply have the time. Right. But we want to prove that there is an unmoved mover, that there is an uncaused cause, and we'll touch on some of the divine attributes and how we can deduce them. All right. Last few things, general notes about the 5 ways. They're not the only ways of Aquinas. You have in your handout there a few other arguments that Aquinas gives in other writings of his. It is true that some of these other arguments come very, very close to the 5 ways. And I would argue that one of them in his work on on essence and being, De Ente et Essentia, on being in essence, I would argue, as many philosophers do, that that's basically the second way. You also have a multiplicity of goodness, and he reasons to a first principle that is good in the De Potentia, in his work De Potentia. That's extremely close to the 4th way, but no cigar. I would argue it's not quite the 4th way. He has an argument in his Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 15, that comes very close to the 3rd way, but I would argue there's a subtle enough nuance. There's a subtle nuance sufficient enough to distinguish the 2 arguments. But that's for in the weeds for people who like to nerd out in philosophy. The point being is that the 5 ways in the Summa Theologiae are not the only ways that Aquinas thinks work in proving God's existence, but that he includes these 5 ways in the Summa Theologiae is an indication that Aquinas thought these are the best. Like these are the easiest, perhaps, and the best, okay? And keep in mind, the reason why these are summaries is because this is a work for beginners in theology, right, who have already had the philosophical training. This is why he's just sketching them out, because the audience, the students that are reading this, already have learned the philosophical environment and background and framework that would allow for them to understand, oh, I see where Aquinas is going with this type of thing.
Yeah, Karlo, that's what blows my mind. Imagine like all the ink that has been spilt on the 5 ways, all the books that have been written on the 5 ways. And if you go and so when I first started jumping into this, I was expecting this is going to be hard to read all of this material from Aquinas on the 5 ways. And I get into the Summa, I open up the Summa, I'm doing my research. Okay, where is it? Okay, I flip over there. Okay, here's where it is, and it's less than a page. It's less than a page of the 5 ways is less than a page, and so
I budgeted an entire weekend. For
this.
I
was thinking I'm gonna be working through essays upon essays upon essays of I knew that's what I knew. This is why we're friends, dude. Like I already knew what he was going to do before he did. Anyway, I was expecting a lot. You don't know
what
more.
I do before I did, okay?
I'm like the unmoved mover of your jokes. I know what's going to happen.
I just want to point out that the Mexican people are clearly the most philosophical people on the planet. I had no idea.
Amen, brother.
But
essay in virtue of which something is something rather than nothing.
Nothing.
Yes. It's like I had no idea that's what they were talking about this whole time.
But like, if you go back and if you go into my point was, you go back into the Summa, you read less than a page of the 5 ways that hundreds of books have been written, tons of ink has been spilt, and that's just the genius of St. Thomas Aquinas and how precise how articulate he is when he's writing all of the Summa.
I could jot down some notes for you. Sure. Here's 5.
The smartest people of the church throughout history have written on this one page of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he's written hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of pages. It's just mind-numbing.
Yeah, just to give you an example, so this leads to the last general note about the 5 ways, is that they are subject to different interpretations, all right? So, for example, I have here in my notes 5 different ways to read the first way.
So there are 5 ways on the first way, yeah.
Now, we are not going to go into all 5 ways, nor we're going to go into the different interpretations of the 5 ways. I'm simply going to present that which I'm satisfied with and how my mind is mapping on with the 5 ways. And I argue, and I think that they work, not only to map on textually with what Aquinas says, but they work philosophically. But what's interesting is that when you take all of the different readings of the 5 ways and you put off to the side the historical reading for a moment, you actually come out with close to like 20 different arguments for God's existence that all work. It's an amazing thing. So like, just to give you another example, the second way, I have 3 different ways you could read the second way, okay? And if you could even include another way and make it 4 different ways to read the second way. The third way, you can read it 5 different ways to read the third way. And this is all coming from the literature. Whenever you dive in to the academic literature on the 5 ways, you have scholars reading these 5 ways in a variety of different ways and different approaches, all depending upon what you think Aquinas is emphasizing at the outset, and then moving to the various principles that are driving the argument. But that's just to let your viewers and your listeners know, guys, that the 5 ways are subject to a variety of different readings. But that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, right? Because there are a variety of ways in which we can demonstrate that God exists. I'm going to present the reading with which I'm most satisfied, right?
But do you think Thomas thought that was going to happen? Like, do you think that he mapped out thinking like that there were going to be so many different interpretations of what he was saying? Because it seems like just the way Thomas works is that he's very articulate, he's very precise.
Yeah, the answer is no. He knew what he was intending to assert. But what's beautiful about this, Adam and David, is that it's the philosophical worldview. It's the philosophical environment and the principles that govern that philosophical cosmos in the mind of Aquinas that's found in his writings that allows philosophers to approach the 5 ways and read them in so many different ways. And so it's just an amazing journey when you study the 5 ways. And so that's just a few general notes on the 5 ways just to be aware of. And then finally, the last section, as y'all see there in the handout, are some objections to God's existence being demonstrated. Now, I skipped over the nature of the five ways as demonstrative arguments because we already touched on that. To the question, can they be demonstrated? Can God's existence be demonstrated? Aquinas answers yes. What kind of demonstrative argument is Aquinas putting forward? We already addressed that. He's putting forward what is called an a posteriori argument or a quia argument. This is an argument that's starting from experience, starting with effects after the fact that we experience them, and reasoning to the existence that an ultimate cause of the thing we're experiencing exists. Hence, it's called a quia argument, coming from the Latin quia, which means that. So that's sort of what's going on there in the handout on the nature of the five ways as demonstrative argument. And I just wanted to emphasize once again, a demonstrative argument leads to a conclusion such that we do not fear it being wrong. The conclusion is necessarily true because it's based upon premises that are necessarily true. Premises that either are self-evident, such as the things of our experience, or premises that can be reduced to first principles of knowledge and being that cannot possibly be denied. Okay? So that's what a demonstrative argument is. Contrast to a probable argument. An argument that leads to probable knowledge is an argument that leads to a conclusion such that it is possible in principle for the conclusion to be wrong, which leaves us with a fear of the conclusion being wrong. And that's because the premises that the conclusion is based upon, in principle, could be falsified. They're not necessarily true. So take, for example, the conclusion that our universe began with a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. That's a conclusion that for which we have probable knowledge. Okay, it's probably true that our universe began with a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, but we cannot say it's necessarily true. The reason is because this conclusion is based upon premises that are only probably true. Information and data that could, in principle, be falsified. Right? This belongs to the nature of modern science. That there could be some discovery that could falsify the data that we're operating on to make the conclusion that our universe began with a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't believe the scientific evidence, because it's very reasonable to assent to such a conclusion, to believe the conclusion to be true. This is what belief is. It's the intellect assenting moved by the will. And so, but it's not necessarily true. So this is the distinction between a probable argument and a demonstrative argument. Aquinas' five ways, in his mind, and I would argue he's correct, are demonstrative arguments, leading to the conclusion that God exists, such that we have no fear that the conclusion is wrong. It cannot be falsified. Let me back up. I have no fear of it being wrong, because to deny such a conclusion would end up having to ultimately deny something that's either self-evident or some first principle of knowledge and being, which could in principle be self-evident, or some principle that's closely related to these self-evident principles that we know is true. So that is just a few notes on the nature of the five ways as demonstrative arguments. Now, I know we're out of time here as far as our little discussion goes. I don't know if there were any questions that came up. And if not, maybe we can address some of the objections. I'm more than happy to take a few extra moments to go forward here.
We do have a couple questions, but before we get to them, I just want to say that like this, looking at these things inspires me with so much joy and anticipation. When Thomas, after he had this mystical experience, looked at all of the work he had done and said it was just nothing but straw. It's like if, for him to have grasped everything to this level, and then to said oh guys, when you get to heaven, this is just gonna be rubbish. This is all gonna be rubbish. I mean, it's like heaven is gonna be awesome. You know what I mean? it's going to
Yeah.
be
But
crazy.
as much of straw that it is definitely an enjoyable straw.
Oh yeah,
Oh, no doubt. I mean, yeah. I
To
mean,
lay our head.
like,
yeah.
uh,
To lay your head on. I like that. Yeah.
This introduction has only like made me think like I am just so pumped
Yeah.
to get into the next 8 lessons because I have so many questions. I was trying to pull back on.
I thought you did good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Overall, I felt like I did well.
Juan, hit us with the first question.
Hey, wait, before you do.
Oh, too late. He already clicked the button.
He already did it. He already. Okay. Oh well, it's how convenient. Dave is the
I need
first
to
question.
change my profile picture.
Dave, you look super cute, man.
What am I doing?
I don't know. So Karlo, which way is your favorite out of all of your out of the 5 ways? Which one do you like? Put your hat on. Like, which one do you like the best?
Yeah, I actually like the second way, which is, I argue, Aquinas' argument in his work on being in essence, De Ente et Essentia. And the reason why I like it is because I think one can immediately grasp that the tree outside is something rather than nothing. And then we begin to inquire, well, there's got to be some principle in virtue of which it is something rather than nothing. Otherwise, it would be nothing.
Yeah, Descartes
that
would disagree
principle
with you, but that's fine.
Well, in other words, if you say there is nothing in virtue of which the tree is something rather than nothing, well, then you're going to have to deny the principle of identity because you're saying being is not distinct from non-being. So there's got to be some distinction between being and non-being in order to hold fast to the principle of identity. And then once we inquire as to what that principle is, we call it an act of being or esse or existence. And then we realize, well, that tree doesn't have existence in virtue of its own essence. And whatever a thing doesn't have in virtue of its own essence, it's got to receive it from something outside of itself. So I like the second way because of the metaphysics involved in it, leading to a being that is pure existence itself, what Aquinas calls ipsum esse subsistens, a being such that doesn't have to receive existence from outside of itself, but just is existence. However, I will agree that the first way perhaps is the easiest for people who aren't familiar with the philosophical principles involved,
Right.
because everybody can start with the motion of the stone. And once you realize, well, that stone can't be moved from point A to point B by itself. It's got to have
The stick
something
moves the
moving it,
stone,
like
the hand moves the stick, which moves the
Right.
stone.
And then it's intuitive that the stick doesn't act as a mover in virtue of being a stick.
Right.
Exactly.
It's deriving its activity of being a mover from the hand, right?
Right.
And then we're off to the races. Can all movers of the stone be such like the stick, receiving its activity of being a mover from outside of itself? And the answer, of course, is going to be no.
No.
And so that's sort of an easier path into arriving to an unmoved mover. However, I must say I do like the third way. I actually wrote a piece for your for your viewers. If you're interested in getting a sneak peek on the third way, you can go to Catholic.com and just type in the third way. And I wrote a brief articulation and defense of the third way without all of the jargon. And everybody can realize, hey, things begin to exist. Can all of reality consist of such things? And then once you kind of go through the philosophical reasoning and say no, which requires a little time, I think most people can get that. Because I would argue, and we'll get into this, the third way is a quasi-Kalam argument. Now, it's not a Kalam argument. Aquinas is not arguing for a beginning of time and physical reality. He's not doing that. But it has some relationship to the Kalam argument. And because of that relationship, I think it's an easy argument to grasp because it does employ this sort of temporal beginning aspect, I would argue, in my reading of the third way.
All
Okay.
right, Juan,
So
next question.
Can I ask?
I will allow
Will
it.
you allow?
I will.
Okay. Karlo, who are the modern philosophers, like the philosophers that are living right now? Who are those that you're reading?
Aside from Adam and I. aside from us.
Take David and Adam, set them aside. Let's bracket them for later. Even though we have not published anything yet.
We publish stuff all year long.
All
year long.
Yes.
In a magazine.
I would assume Gavin Kerr is one that you enjoy, but
right.
Who are the philosophers that you read?
Miley Cyrus.
Yeah. So I am trained in the Thomistic tradition. So a lot of the philosophers that I read are Thomist philosophers, trained in the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas. So you mentioned one, Gavin Kerr is a great philosopher that I thoroughly enjoy reading. I enjoy reading Dr. Edward Fazer's work. So he is a Thomist who's made Thomas's thought popular. And that's not to say that he's made it like simplified versions. I mean, it still does require some work to understand. But Dr. Fazer is such a skilled writer and presenter of Thomas's thought that he has done a great service to the Thomistic tradition in presenting it. Another great Thomist philosopher and theologian that I enjoy reading is Father Thomas Joseph White. Mm-hmm. There's another Thomist philosopher that I have been reading, John Canazas is his name, Knasas. He has some good stuff on Thomistic thought. Joseph Owens is a Thomist philosopher who has contributed to the Thomistic tradition. He's done a lot of work on that. So those are a few authors that come to mind right away that I enjoy reading.
Do people who like try to be Thomists but then turn out not to be smart enough, do they become like Jesuit philosophers or?
Don't answer that. You don't have to answer that. No, you don't have to answer that. Go to the next question.
Perhaps.
This is a Juan question. It's coming from the Catholic Man Show. So it says, if God holds all things in existence, how can God hold in existence something that is not his will or something that is contrary to his will?
That which is not his will does not exist.
Boom.
So it would be an absence of being. Whatever God decrees to exist, exists. Whatever God decrees not to exist, does not exist. To state it differently, whatever God decrees to be actual, it is actual. Whatever God decrees to be non-actual, it's either going to be non-actual insofar as its impotency to being actual or non-being whatsoever.
So does evil exist? Does evil exist?
I mean, yeah, now we're getting into like his it's like his
God
his will
does not sustain
permissive or actual
existence.
will.
God does not sustain evil in existence.
Right.
Because evil, when considered in and of itself, is a privation of being,
right,
or of a do good. So God does not sustain evil in existence because evil is not something to be sustained in existence by the source of being.
Mm-hmm. There are beings who commit evil actions.
And the activity that the being is engaging in is positive being, falls under the umbrella of being. So the activity itself falls under the umbrella of being and therefore has its cause in God.
Mm-hmm.
But the evil in the action is going to be a privation of being, a privation of due order, which is not sustained in being by God.
That's why
it's a privation. It's a purification.
That's why we can say that Satan is good in as much as he exists.
Correct. But the disorder in his will, the deviation from God's divine design, you might say, or the order of good, is due to his own will alone,
right,
and not the Creator. God permits it, and such a deviation would not be possible without God's permission, but God does not sustain it in being, the deviation itself, the privation itself.
This is also why we can properly say that decaf coffee is evil, because there is a good that is natural to it that has been deprived. And so we have, once again, the deprivation of a good which should exist that does not exist.
But the substance of that which we call decaf coffee is sustained in being by God.
Right, even though it's evil.
Which is why also, like, when,
Yeah.
in the Bible, when it says, when Jesus was talking about Judas, and it would have been better that he'd never been born, like, that was something I wrestled with for a while, right?
I was also thinking about bringing that up.
Were you?
Yeah.
Like, Jesus is saying, it's better than that this man had never been born. Yet, Aquinas says that existence in and of itself is a good. And so Jesus is saying,
right,
it would have been better that this guy
I think
never exists.
Thomas even said it's better for Judas to exist in hell than to not exist at all. Or it's better for a man to exist in hell.
Thomas Aquinas has this view that existence is a good. And so when we're trying to articulate why would God create a rational creature such that he's going to, from all eternity, permit to fall into mortal sin and eventually go to hell, why would God even establish such an order of providence? One possible answer that theists have given, such as Aquinas, that existence in and of itself is a manifestation of the divine essence. And even for a rational creature to have the possibility of salvation rather than not is a good that's sufficient to account for why God would create such an order of providence. Right. It is a difficult mystery to wrestle with.
Yeah, because that isn't...
it's difficult to square with Christ's words saying it's better
for him never to have been born. Maybe I don't understand it fully, because
now,
what you just said,
I guess you could
say...
He didn't say it's better that he never existed, but it would have been better that he was never born. Perhaps that's...
I don't know, but like that...
Because Christ didn't make,
and this
he didn't make an error.
Deficiency in my understanding. It's
right,
because I don't get how what you just said can reconcile with what Christ says, that he would never have been born. It would have been better if he would never have been born.
That he had died in utero. I mean, that could be the answer.
Well, one possible answer. I'm not saying this is the right answer, but I could see some philosophers / scripture scholars saying Jesus is using hyperbole here. And this possibly would be the line that one would take in order to counter the claim that Jesus is saying Judas is in hell here, right? That's one possible answer. That could square the apparent circle. So maybe Jesus is using hyperbole. Now that doesn't mean there is no hell. That would just be one way of countering that one argument for hell, right? Namely appealing to Jude.
It just there's a lot of things.
Another reason, Jesus could be just saying that specifically for that one individual person. Just because the line of argumentation would not work for that one specific person, it doesn't mean it wouldn't work for others, right? Because the existence of such another rational creature could be a good that appropriately manifests the divine wisdom and the divine essence within this particular order of providence. I mean, think about this. There is an order of providence where God could possibly have willed with no rational creatures, right? And that would have been a manifestation of the divine essence.
Sure.
So there's a lack of existence there concerning human beings. But God willed an order of providence where you do have a manifestation of the divine essence by way of rational creatures, both corporeal and incorporeal. So the point being is that we can affirm that existence is a good and that God possibly could will that the existence of a rational creature, even though such a rational creature will definitively be separated from him. That's a legitimate line of argumentation. And that coheres with, I think, the statement that Jesus says specifically about Judas. I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive of each other. But that's what I would say here. I'd have to think about it a little bit more to maybe articulated.
Yeah, and I would like to think about it. Like, so I asked actually the prior of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington D.C., Father Aquinas. He's actually a Louisianan. He's Father Aquinas
from Karen Crow, right?
Yes. And I asked him this, and he, in his, let me first preface, he is a man that is just amazing. I mean, he is a phenomenal man, very willing to just sit, like, he was very generous with his time, very willing to sit there with me and entertain my elementary questions that I had for him. And I threw that question out there to him, and he in his humble nature just was like, yes, that is a good question. I will need to think about that more. And I knew he knew the answer to this question. He knows this, but I don't understand enough of my question really for him to give me a sufficient answer.
Yes,
because
that is a good question. I know the answer, but I will have to think about how to explain
how to dumb it down
to someone like you.
And that's not how he approached it. It actually took me a few weeks as I was replaying it in my head for my realization of understanding, like, because at first
de-inflating your pride.
I gotta tell you, I gotta tell you, my
pride
was way up there, Karlo. I was like, bro, I just stumped, a Dominican prior who has dedicated his life to reading Aquinas, and I threw out a question to him. He doesn't know the answer, and so my pride was inflated big time. And as the weeks went on, and I replayed it in my head, I realized
I'm not saying this is the definitive answer, but this is a thought that just occurred to me. Okay, so whenever we're talking about orders of providence that God can will, and whenever we talk about orders of providence that God can will, we affirm that different orders of providence can have more goodness quantitatively within that order of providence. Okay? Now, and this is the reason why that we say there's no best possible world, in the sense that this is like the only world that God could possibly have created. Okay? Mm-hmm. Aquinas affirms that whenever we consider the order of providence, there can be more goodness in the very order of providence that we have, like quantitative goodness. So there could possibly have been an order of providence where Judas did not betray Jesus, and that would have been more good quantitatively within that order of providence, because you would have had one more human being in that order of providence acting virtuously.
Right. That would have ended up being in the kingdom. Right.
So consider that order of providence as having more good. So in that sense, we can say it would have been better that Judas did not betray Jesus than betraying Jesus. Because in that sense, there would be more good in the order of providence quantitatively. And so it's possible that we could jibe Jesus' statement with that philosophical articulation. It would have been better that he had not been born. In other words, had Judas not been born, there would have been less evil, quantitatively speaking, in this order of providence, and thus more good in this order of providence. Now, what Aquinas wants to say concerning this order of providence, that this is the best possible world given the ends or the goals that God wants to achieve in creating an order of providence. So the order of providence considered as a whole is perfect, in the sense that everything is rightly ordered to the end for which God creates this order of providence, whatever that end may be. And we can speculate about that. But there could be more goodness in the order of providence. So I would say possibly that that's one way you could jibe Jesus' statement with this philosophical understanding of existence being a good. Jesus is not saying, what Jesus is not saying is that Judas's existence is not good.
Right.
He's not saying that because he would be contradicting.
Right. He can't say that. Right. He can't say that.
So what possibly else could he mean? How can we hold on to the goodness of Judas's existence, but yet still affirm that it would have been better had he not existed?
And it's only because of God's permissive will that he even existed.
Right. Well, no, not for permissive will. It's by virtue of his simple will that Judas exists, because God willed him to be.
I'm sorry, that he allowed him to do what he did. Like, it's through his permissive will.
That's in virtue of God's permissive decree, that God permits Judas to fall into sin rather than giving him a grace that would move him to not sin, to uphold him in the good.
Okay, so
let's just be honest. Judas is totally in hell. He's totally in hell. I mean,
well, we don't. Well, I'm not going to go
the church. The church is not going to pronounce that.
Right.
But if anybody's in hell, it's totally Judas.
Right. Yeah. No.
Would I say that I lean in the direction of wanting to affirm that conclusion? Yes, I'll admit that. But I can't say it definitively because, number one, the church has never said it, and we just don't know. I mean, there's ways of reconciling Jesus' statement.
We don't know his heart.
Judas,
we don't know. Yeah, we don't know his heart. Sure.
Well, we don't know if God gave Judas the grace of repentance the moment before separation of body and soul.
I tend to lean though with Jesus saying it would be better that he never was born, meaning that he's totally in hell. That's a way to interpret. So I'm not judging. I'm not passing judgment myself. I'm just simply that's the way I take Christ's words to be.
How non-Balthazarian of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair way to interpret them.
Okay, so Karlo, here's the deal. We're already past our time on the introduction, which I think.
And we've definitively concluded that Judas is in hell.
No. So Karlo,
I have not.
No, Karlo is not. Catholic Answers.
I'm not saying it. The church is saying.
Catholic Answers cannot fire Karlo for this. Karlo, so we had a couple guys already comment on our live stream. Thank you for a very thorough introduction. Tom was one of them.
Can you put up one of those? Put up a
was very
thank
grateful
you comment.
for even just us going through this. I'm pumped about just getting into the nitty gritty. If you think we've gotten into the nitty gritty now, just wait, because Wednesday here in a couple days we're gonna get into way more.
You just wait.
Yeah, and I'm trying to pump through this Gary Gould-Lagrange book of The Principle of Finality, so that way I can have it read by the time we get to the Fifth Way, that his new translation that was published. But so Karlo, here's what I'd like to do. I would like to wrap this up for tonight, because we do have other questions, but let's table them for as we continue going through. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say for the viewers and for your listeners in the future there, to be sure to look at the handout for the three objections that Aquinas considers to demonstrating God's existence, because they're very insightful into sort of understanding Aquinas' approach here, that they can indeed be demonstrated. Aquinas is one implication of answering these objections. Aquinas is not, I'll just say this in conclusion, Aquinas is not starting with knowledge of what God is. We don't know what God is. Aquinas is working with the notion of a cause of the effect that we experience. So an ultimate mover of the motion we experience, an ultimate cause of the existence of things in our experience in the world, a maximal being that accounts for the degrees of perfection that we experience in our lives, an undirected, directing intelligence that accounts for the directed activity of unintelligent things. These are the notions of God that Aquinas is working with. He is not starting with knowledge of God's essence or the nature of God. He's starting with effects and reasoning to a cause of those effects. So that's just the last thing I'll say in conclusion that sort of wraps up, sums up his answers to these three objections.
Okay, so at this point, I think that this is good enough for the introduction. We will conclude here. We're going to be going back in 2 days and on Wednesday to go through the first argument from motion, which Karlo has already said. We have 2 full episodes that we're going to be going through, or 2 courses that we will be going through, lessons that we'll be going through on motion. So we'll table all of this and we'll conclude here. I'm super pumped about just being able to talk with you and geek out with you for a little bit, Karlo, because I have a lot of, and everybody will know here pretty soon, as we go through these, I have a lot of questions that I would love to geek out with, and I don't have a Karlo in our lives that we can just throw out all these questions to you and feel good about having a conversation with. So I'm super excited just to talk to you for this month.
Yeah. Also, when are you going to move to Tulsa? That's
this is what we need to do.
That's the real
Tulsa's
question
where
here.
it's at.
Hey, you got to make a pitch to the boss here at Catholic Answers for Catholic Answers to set up a remote shop over there. Did
you know that if you have like a 20 square foot shack in California, you can sell that shack and buy a 3,000 square foot home and have money left over?
Don't tell everybody this.
I'm only telling the people on our on our Patreon.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
This is the paid information. Okay. That shack can make you a rich man in Oklahoma. Okay.
I will say that the times that you guys have brought me to Tulsa to visit you guys, I've always felt at home over there. So,
well, awesome.
Karlo,
well, okay,
gosh.
So Karlo, we'll end here. Juan, if you'll go ahead and cut it off here, and we'll pick up on Wednesday. Just keep. This is how we will implement the next one. So
I just want to throw out there, this whiskey we've been drinking tonight was incredible.
It's very delicious.
We've been drinking, just so you know, this is the Port Charlotte heavily peated 10-year.
Very good.
Super good. We're on the Lord's team.
The winning side.
So raise your glass.
Cheers, Karlo.
And cheers to Jesus.
There it is.
Nice.